So we're here to solve this Fillomino by John Bulten. It has an immediate and important aha at the start of the puzzle, and then it has a set of harder but interesting deductions along the way. It's not exactly like some other Fillomino we have, and so while this will be a video that maybe teaches some unusual steps, hopefully it also teaches some basic steps. Most people probably can write these first pieces in the grid. There's even a little more you can do in this corner. A traditional Fillomino rule has to do with creating choke points, and there's a case where if the 4 doesn't take this cell, it's going to come down and take the cell and cut off the 5, which means even the 5 is going to take this, stuff like this. But this is almost a limit of what you can capture in the grid without seeing the first aha. And the first aha is helped a little bit by recognizing while the grid itself isn't fully symmetric, there is one very symmetric element about it, and that is these 8 6s which are given in the grid. Each of them is on the opposite end of a 4x4 square. They're almost 7 cells apart if you try to draw a connective path between ones that are in the same position. Effectively, that means there are at least 8 polyominoes of size 6. None of these 6s can be part of the same polyomino, and so in this case 48 cells are accounted for in those groups. You'll also notice, although these aren't symmetrically placed, there are 8 total 5s in the grid. Those 5s are at least 6, sometimes more cells away. Like this 5 isn't near anything else, but this 5 and this 5, they're 6 cells away, 6 cells away, 6 cells away, 6 cells away, 6 cells away. And so we can similarly at the start say there are at least 8 groups of size 5 for another 40 cells. And then you'll see that there is 1 1, 2 2s, a 3, and a given 4. And those collectively account for another 12, and that equals 100 cells. That's the whole size of the grid. So a way we could describe this as a variation, which would kind of give away the aha at the start, is to say that in this variation of Fillomino, every polyomino has exactly one given number. There are no hidden polyominoes with 0 given numbers, and there are no polyominoes that will take 2 of the given numbers. And what that means, since we're using just shapes in the grid, is there are different spots where we'll be fairly constrained in how we can fill things. At the top, we have a few other numbers around, not just 5 and 6. Like 3s can get to different spots, 4s and 2s can get to different spots. On the bottom down here, particularly in the lowermost row, the only digits that can be used are 6 and 5, based on the reach of things around them. And one immediate challenge is we need to place a 5 somewhere on this row that separates these 2 6 groups. And you can say, well, this 5 is close, but it can't actually come over and come down and hit this row without choking off or compressing this polyomino 6 to be too small. Similarly, this one can't get over. The exact and only group that can get a 5 into this row in a valid state is this 5, which comes straight down, forming an I pentomino. We can then fill in the rest of these cells in the row as 6s, and because of the constraint of how limited the grid is, we now should actually focus every time we finish a polyomino on the edges of that polyomino and what can reach that. And so here, there's a unique digit which can reach it, which is a 6 that actually finishes this shape. Looking at the rest of this cell can be a 2, but these 2 cells have to be at least 5s. The only option that can reach into them, and once they're 5s, we can see the only 5 they can connect to is this one, and so we can do this over here. On the leftmost edges of this shape, this has to be 6s. There's no smaller number than the 6 you can touch here, and similarly across this whole vertical column, similarly all of those have to be 6s, and so you can make some pretty quick progress and then even get this shape in by just focusing on the edges around completed polyominoes. We now will have to efficiently fill this lower right corner with 2 6s and 2 5s. I guess one way to start is just by the count of cells. Recognize this 5 is going to come in. Most of the cells on this column will be 5s. 4 of them will be 5s. The last will be the last 6 coming off from this. And one thing to notice is on the extremes, if a 6 is here and these all are 5s, there's no way we can form a valid shape. If this is a 6 and all of these are 5s, there's no way to form a valid shape. So some of these on the edges are identifiable right away. This cell is certainly identifiable right away. These maybe aren't, and so there's a 6 somewhere there. We don't know which one. A thing to recognize is we're going to form an efficient packing of the space, get some kind of checkerboard pattern like this, which is 2 6s and 2 5s in one of these orientations. And so we can actually say it's when you know one of these is a 6, the opposite corner of this is a 6, the opposite corners of both of those are 5s. And what that actually will mean, given that we're going to need to have a 5 somewhere splitting 6s in this row, the only 5 that can reach into this is a 5 that goes in this cell. And so to actually be able to separate these groups fully, to get this kind of shape, this is where the last 5 goes. This is where a 5 from above comes. And we get this shape, we get this 6 completing here, we get that 5 here. We now have 2 new edges. We should figure out what goes there. The 3 can't reach into them, so these must again be 6s. This 6 shape has to use one of these cells, so this is where the 6 comes. And so this is a split point. It's going to come out. You could think it could be a 5, but that's not leaving enough room over here, so the only thing can actually be is a 3. We still need to fill 6 total cells here. We have 7 cells that are available, so 1 from the 5 comes down. We get this completion here. We have a little more trickiness on this part to solve it. One thing that's useful at the star is to see that this 5 can't take this cell. That would cut off the option from one of the remaining ones coming in. A different way to say that is this digit must be a 6. Again, if it were a 5, it would create too large a group and no other number can reach to it. Even that said, we can think a little bit about the opportunities for this 6 to come around versus this other shape to go. There's a cell you can think a little bit about, and let's sort of see the best way to do this. If the 6 comes like so, the 5 takes this 6 is going to take at least this cell. So if this group is coming from the top, it's not taking any more cells than these 4. This is a 5th, this is a 6th cell. So we can get this into the grid, which then actually gets us at least one more cell from a 5 into the grid. And now we can come down to this spot and say, can this cell be a 5? If this cell is a 5, then the 6 can take as many as 5 cells. Remember, the last cell is going to be somewhere for this 5, but then it's going to be forced to take a cell like this. And so the critical deduction I found was getting that this cell is a 6. Part of this shape. What's really critical about that is we now have 2 different triomino-like pieces, and they can't themselves join. And so we get this point, which isn't a part of any 6. It can't be a 4, it can't be a 2, it must be a 5, and get this into the grid. We still don't fully know if this 6 comes from here or not, but the way to resolve that is to start to think about what is the home for this 5. And the critical thinking is that if this is coming across like so, we get a space where a ton of this 6 has to come into this row, a ton of this 6 has to come across, and we get a set of places we can't separate, that we actually need to have a lot of this 5 coming below to keep these 6s from colliding. There are certain cells that you just can't reach. That's not an issue if the 5 comes above, and so from efficient space packing, particularly when we start to see some of these other cells that must be used, we can even, I think it's possible at this point to say that at least the 4 or 5 uses this cell, that this has to be a vertical 5. These 4 cells will take a 5th somewhere, we don't know exactly where, but 1, 2, 3, 4, some number of 5, these connect like so. It's very, the first you can actually enforce is that this cell must be a 6. One of these is going to be the last cell, so this is not used. That then forces this to be a 5, which makes this shape happen, which makes this be the last for that 5. Again, looking at the edges, these must be 6s. We've done a lot of thinking like this so far, so hopefully this is familiar. This is now an edge. It has to be a 5, but it's going to cause an issue with this 5, so it looks like this. We just are going to fill all the remaining space in this corner with those shapes. This is 6 and 6. We have to get 5s into the spot. That finishes this. pentomino. Get one more 6 on this edge, one more 6 on this edge. These now can't touch. They also can't come from the 5, so this is the 2. The last 6 cell is this one. The last 5 for this group is there. And we finished the 6s over here. So this is a fairly tricky puzzle. It's helped by, as we mentioned, doing some things like recognizing these checkerboard intersections of groups. It's certainly recognized, it helped at the start by recognizing there are 100 total cells in the grid, which is a unique part of this pattern. It's something you'll see on the hardest Fillominos where you're almost limited by size for some of the shapes in the grid. It was even a feature which was true of the Friday cipher puzzle, which also had almost a 1 to 10 theme, and 1 to 9 plus 1 to 10 is 45 plus 55 is 100. Once you can identify that there aren't multiple large groups, you can get through that one. So the count of Fillominos is sometimes useful, but in this puzzle is quite interesting. Once we knew the count was essential and that polyominoes used exactly one given, is how we could like look around the edges of filled shapes and say what numbers are left around some of those edges. Even in regular Fillomino puzzles that aren't as unusual as this one, it still can be useful to look at some of these points, like where we have this 1 and 5 completed, like what number can go in the cell. It could be a 2, a 3, a 4, a 6, things of that sort. And the puzzle will sometimes tell you exactly what it must be. And so not just looking at the numbers, but looking at finished shapes and the edges and the corners that are sort of made around them is sometimes critical. So we hope you got through this puzzle, or at least learned something from this walkthrough that will help you get through future puzzles, and we'll see you again soon.